The shadow over table 7. The Gilded Spoon was not an ordinary restaurant, and everyone who had ever stepped foot inside knew it. The crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow that softened even the hardest lines of the men in sharp suits and women in dresses that cost more than a year's rent. Every detail was carefully chosen, the fresh flowers brought in daily, the hand-polished cutlery that could catch light like a jewel, the discreet music of violins that floated through the air, as if it had been rehearsed for a lifetime. For many of the city's elite, the restaurant was more than a place to eat. It was a stage to display wealth, power, and untouchable influence. The staff moved like trained actors, rehearsing lines of courtesy and bowing with the exact right amount of respect without ever daring to overstep. For years, the unwritten rule in that place was simple. You could shine, but never brighter than the guests. And yet, for all the grandeur of the Gilded Spoon, Tuesdays had a reputation that made even the bravest waiters find excuses to disappear into the storerooms or linger too long polishing a glass in the bar. Tuesdays belonged to Victor Blackwell. He was not the richest man in the city, but he was close, and certainly the most feared. His empire was built on logistics, an industry few understood yet everyone relied on. Ships, trucks, cargo planes, and warehouses bore his mark, moving goods across continents with ruthless efficiency. His name had been carved into magazines, his face photographed beside politicians and royalty. On paper, he was the model of discipline, strategy, and success. In the world of the Gilded Spoon, however, he was known as something else entirely. The man you prayed never to serve. The stories about him were whispered like ghost tales. One waiter claimed Victor had once dismissed a sommelier on the spot for offering the wrong wine with too much confidence. Another swore a young busboy had spilled water on the edge of Victor's napkin and never returned to work the next day, his family business losing a contract soon after. None of these stories were written down, none proven, but they circulated from one staff member to another until they became legend. Whenever his sleek black Rolls-Royce glided to the curb, conversation died. Laughter softened. Even footsteps on the marble slowed as though the building itself held its breath. Victor Blackwell was more than a guest. He was a storm wrapped in a suit, and every Tuesday was his performance. That evening began like many others. The restaurant buzzed with the early dinner crowd, a blur of clinking glasses, laughter, and murmured deals. In the staff lounge behind the bar, a quiet dread settled over the team as the clock ticked toward 7. Greg, the front desk host, glanced at the cameras and saw the familiar sight. The polished car easing forward, its lights reflecting like liquid fire against the glass doors. His throat tightened and he whispered the words no one wanted to hear. "He's here." In that instant, the mood shifted. Veterans of the staff disappeared with sudden urgency, some to the cellar, some to the back kitchens. A hush traveled through the servers like a ripple across water. It was as though everyone had been trained to move away from the path of a dangerous predator. Only one thing mattered now. Who would draw the short straw for table 7? In the corner stood Aisha. Ross, adjusting the tie of her apron with trembling fingers she forced to stay steady. She was 24 years old, just 2 weeks into the job, and unlike the others, she had no memory of Victor Blackwell's past outbursts, no scars of humiliation carried from serving him. She had heard the warnings whispered in the break room, seen the nervous glances of her co-workers when his name was mentioned, but she had never faced him herself. For her, this job was not a career choice or a dream. It was survival. Her mother, Elaine, lived with a chronic illness that demanded costly medication. Her younger sister, Maya, was brilliant but in college with tuition bills that loomed like dark clouds over their small home. Every hour Aisha worked was a piece of that burden lifted, every paycheck a chance to keep their heads above water. The Gilded Spoon had been her lifeline, and she had fought for it despite the polite but sharp reminders that she did not quite fit the image the restaurant liked to present. She was young, black, and unapologetically herself in a place where appearances mattered more than reality. The mock lottery was quick and merciless. The slips of paper were drawn, and as though fate had been waiting to test her, the shortest one landed in Aisha's hand. For a brief moment, the air in the staff lounge froze. Aisha felt every pair of eyes on her, some filled with pity, others with thinly veiled relief that it was not them. She did not flinch. Instead, she straightened her apron, smoothed her skirt, and checked her hands were not shaking. She lifted her chin the way her mother had always taught her to, when the world tried to make her small. Mr. Carter, the floor manager, leaned close to her. His voice was firm but carried a weight of fear. Table 7. Victor Blackwell, just be a machine. Fast, clean, not clever, not smart. Don't look him in the eye. Do the job and leave. His advice was less guidance than survival strategy. Words passed down like an heirloom of caution. From across the room, Brenda, a server with 10 years of experience and a smirk that cut sharper than her words, added her own warning. Sweetheart, remember to keep your tone gentle. VIPs are picky. Her voice dripped with false sweetness, but beneath it was something harsher, a prejudice Aisha had already grown used to. To Brenda, gentle meant obedient and picky meant volatile. Aisha simply nodded politely, masking the sting with the same quiet strength she had used to survive countless small jabs and judgments since childhood. When she finally stepped out into the dining room, the atmosphere seemed to change. The music of violins continued, but softer somehow, as though the notes themselves were holding back. Conversations dimmed. Aisha walked toward the infamous Table 7, and though the path was short, it stretched in her mind like a long corridor. The chandeliers gleamed above her. The polished wooden floor reflected fragments of light, and every step seemed to echo louder than it should have. Table 7 sat in a slightly recessed area overlooking the glittering city lights beyond the glass. There, as expected, sat Victor Blackwell. He leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on a half-filled glass of scotch. His salt and pepper hair framed a face carved with sharp angles, and his cold gray eyes seemed to calculate everything they touched. He did not look up when she approached, as if acknowledging her presence would be a waste of his time. "Good evening, sir," Aisha said softly, her voice steady but warm enough to escape coldness. "The Gilded Spoon is honored to serve you tonight. May I present the menu?" The moment his eyes lifted and locked onto hers, Aisha felt the air tighten. His gaze swept over her, from her name tag to the hem of her apron, not in desire or admiration, but in the same way a man might examine a machine for flaws. Silence stretched uncomfortably, and from across the room someone dropped a napkin clip, the small clang ringing like a church bell in the stillness. "You're new," Victor said finally. It was not a question but a statement of judgment. "Yes, sir," Aisha replied, her voice even. "Second week. They let rookies take Table 7 now," he said, his words slow and heavy. Standards here must have dropped. The insult landed like a stone, but Aisha's smile remained faint and composed. In her mind flashed the image of her mother's medical bills, her sister's tuition, the red numbers in her bank account. For a brief moment she considered lowering her eyes, whispering an apology, and walking away quietly as others had before her. But something inside her rebelled. She would not allow herself to be erased. The only standard that might drop tonight, "Sir," she said gently, "is the butter melting on the bread? If you don't order it quickly enough." The words were polite, not sharp, but laced with quiet courage. The dining room seemed to freeze in shock. At the nearby table, a server stopped mid-step. At the bar, Brenda's eyes widened, her frown aimed not at Victor, but at Aisha, silently, scolding her for daring to speak with spirit. Victor's face remained unreadable, but for the briefest moment something flickered in his eyes, a spark of surprise, as if he had heard a note in a song that didn't belong but somehow intrigued him. He set his scotch back onto its coaster with precise care, his voice flat and cold. "Filet mignon. Medium rare but closer to rare. If the center is still pink, it goes back. Sauce separate. Don't pour, don't touch. And bring me a Petrus." 1982. He had not even opened the menu. Aisha wrote each word down steadily, not a flicker of hesitation in her face. She knew what Petrus 1982 was, one of the rarest, most revered wines, a liquid prayer that cost more than most people made in a month. Marco, the sommelier, had once spoken of it in hushed tones, as though describing a holy relic. "Yes, sir," Aisha replied calmly. She stepped back with measured grace and walked toward the kitchen, every step deliberate, as though she had been rehearsing for this moment her entire life. Behind her, Victor Blackwell's gaze lingered on her retreating figure, and though his expression gave nothing away, something in the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time in years, Table 7 did not feel like a graveyard of silence. It felt like the beginning of something unpredictable. And deep down, Aisha knew it too. She had not only survived the first act of Victor Blackwell's test, but she had also forced the director to rewrite the script. What came next was a storm she could not yet see, but she was ready to face it. Whispers. In the kitchen, the night after Victor Blackwell's meal, the gilded spoon carried an energy unlike any other evening. Normally, the staff would relax once he had left, as if a heavy curtain had been pulled back to let fresh air in again. Laughter would return to the staff room, conversations would bubble up louder, and the tension that had hung over the dining room would dissolve like steam from a boiling pot. But this time, something different lingered in the air. Aisha's boldness had unsettled the rhythm. It had been quiet, subtle, not the loud defiance of someone trying to make a statement, but it had been noticed all the same. She had looked him in the eye. She had answered back without fear, and instead of punishment, she had walked away with the largest tip the restaurant had seen in years. That paradox clung to every whispered conversation behind the swinging kitchen doors. The next morning, Brenda was the first to speak. She stood by the espresso machine in the break area, stirring sugar into her coffee with exaggerated slowness, her eyes fixed on Aisha. "You think you're special now?" she asked, her voice low but sharp enough for others to hear. "One good night and suddenly you're above the rules?" The words weren't just a question, they were an accusation. A few other staff members glanced nervously at the exchange, their hands busy polishing cutlery or folding napkins, but their ears tilted toward the conversation. Aisha did not rise to the bait. She was used to this kind of challenge. Jealousy, dressed up as concern, criticism framed as wisdom. "I did my job," she said calmly, her voice even. "That's all." She did not mention the tip, did not mention the way Victor's eyes had flickered when she spoke, did not mention the way the dining room had hushed. She knew that in places like this, humility was a shield, but the whispers grew throughout the day. Greg at the front desk told a busboy in hushed tones that he had never seen Victor pause like that before. Marco, the sommelier, muttered to Chef Tony that the man's usual coldness had cracked for the briefest second. Even Mr. Carter, the floor manager, who had seen nearly everything in his 20 years at the Gilded Spoon, admitted privately that Aisha had done something no one else dared. But his words to her were laced with warning. "Listen," Carter said quietly as he pulled her aside before the evening rush. His weathered face looked even older under the fluorescent staff room lights. "What you did last night was brave, too brave. But bravery here doesn't always keep you safe. Men like Victor Blackwell don't like being challenged, and even when they don't show it, they find ways to remind people where the power lies. Be careful." Aisha met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "I didn't disrespect him, I only did my job." Carter sighed. "Respect is not the same for everyone. For some, it means obedience. For others, it means silence. You need to understand which kind of man you're dealing with." She nodded, but inside, she thought of her mother's tired smile, her sister's hopeful eyes, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter back home. She could not afford to shrink herself. Not here. Not anywhere. Respect went both ways, and if she was expected to serve flawlessly, then at the very least, she would not erase her dignity. By the time Tuesday rolled around again, the staff were on edge. The lottery slips were unnecessary this time. Everyone already knew who would be serving table 7. Aisha. The unspoken truth was that once you had faced Victor Blackwell, once you had survived, you became the chosen one to face him again. No one else wanted to risk it. When Victor arrived, the same hush fell over the restaurant. His presence was like a shadow stretching across the room, swallowing laughter and muting conversations. Aisha carried the leather-bound menu with the same calm grace as before, though her heart beat louder in her chest than the violins playing in the background. She approached him with a steady smile, the kind that revealed nothing of the nerves fluttering beneath her skin. This time he looked up before she even spoke. His gray eyes met hers directly, and though his face betrayed nothing, she felt a weight in that stare, as though he was measuring not just her competence, but her courage. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone respectful but clear. "You again," Victor said, his voice flat, almost unreadable. "I thought they rotated staff." "They do," Aisha answered, holding his gaze. "But tonight I'm honored to serve you again." It was a simple reply, polite on the surface, but layered with quiet resolve. She would not apologize for her presence. She would not shrink. Victor's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but not entirely neutral either. "Very well," he said, closing the menu without opening it. "The lamb rack, medium rare, sauce on the side, and bring me a Chateau Margaux, 1996. Decant it properly, I don't like haste." Aisha wrote the order with steady hands, repeating each detail back to him without a stumble. As she turned toward the kitchen, she felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, the invisible weight of their anticipation. They were waiting for her to slip, waiting for the story of her courage to turn into a cautionary tale. In the kitchen, Marco's eyebrows rose when he heard the wine request. "Chateau Margaux 96?" he muttered, almost reverently. "That's a king's ransom in a bottle. Then let's treat it like one," Aisha replied calmly. She stood by his side as he retrieved the bottle from the cellar, watching every careful movement. She knew Victor would notice even the smallest flaw, and she refused to give him the satisfaction of finding one. As the lamb sizzled on the grill and the wine breathed in the decanter, the whispers continued behind her back. Brenda shook her head, muttering that Aisha was playing with fire. Another server whispered that Victor would crush her sooner or later, that no one defied him twice without consequence. But when Aisha returned to table 7 with the meal and the wine, she carried herself with the same calm grace as before. She poured the wine slowly, carefully, the ruby liquid catching the chandelier's glow like liquid fire. She set the plate before him with practiced precision, the sauce on the side exactly as requested. Victor lifted his fork, inspected the lamb, and took a slow bite. He chewed, swallowed, then set the fork down with deliberate care. His eyes met hers again. "Better," he said simply. It was not praise, but it was not dismissal either. It was acknowledgement. And in the world of Victor Blackwell, that was rarer than gold. The rest of the evening passed in tense silence, each movement of hers watched, each moment weighed. When she finally slipped the bill into its leather folder, he signed without hesitation, leaving behind another tip larger than anyone else had ever received. But this time, there was something more. Beneath the tip, in his sharp, angular handwriting, he had written 2 words. "Not bad." Aisha stared at the words for a moment, her heart pounding. It was not kindness, not warmth, but it was something unexpected. A crack in the armor, a shift in the story. In the staff room later that night, Carter pulled her aside again, his voice low and urgent. "Be careful, Aisha. He doesn't give attention without reason. If he's noticing you, it means something, and with a man like him, that can be dangerous." Aisha listened, but inside, she felt something different stirring. For years, Victor Blackwell had been a storm no one dared to face. But storms were not invincible. Sometimes they broke against the strength of someone who refused to bow. And though she did not yet know it, she had already begun to rewrite not just the script of Table 7, but the script of Victor Blackwell's life. Storms and secrets. When Aisha left the Gilded Spoon that night, the city streets greeted her with a kind of silence she had come to know well. The world outside glittered with the hum of neon signs and the faint echo of late-night traffic, but none of it mattered compared to the numbers spinning in her mind. She clutched her bag tight, feeling the folded bills inside, heavier than she had expected. Another tip that nearly doubled her week's pay. Another gesture from the man everyone else feared. Yet what unsettled her wasn't the money. It was the message he had left beneath it. Not bad. Those two words looped in, her thoughts like an unfinished melody. It wasn't praise, it wasn't warmth, it was a recognition. And that recognition carried weight she hadn't asked for. At home, the weight of reality was even sharper. Their small apartment smelled faintly of lavender, a scent her mother loved even if they could only afford the cheap candles from the discount store. Elaine Ross sat curled in her chair by the window, her face pale from the medication but still glowing with the quiet dignity that had carried her through years of illness. She smiled when Aisha came in, the kind of smile that cost strength but gave back more love than it took. On the couch lay Maya's textbook spread open like wings, the young woman herself asleep with a pen still clutched in her hand. The sight filled Aisha's chest with a mixture of pride and ache. She laid the tip envelope on the table beside her mother. "This will cover the medicine this month," she said softly. "And part of Maya's tuition, too." Elaine touched her daughter's hand gently. "You're working too hard, Aisha. Don't let that place take everything from you." Aisha smiled faintly, though exhaustion tugged at her eyes. "It's not just the place, Ma. It's who comes to it. Some people walk in and make the air heavy. But I can't back down. I won't." Her mother studied her quietly, then nodded. "You're stronger than I ever was. But remember, strength isn't just standing tall. Sometimes it's knowing when to bend so you don't break." Those words stayed with her through the following week. Every shift felt heavier now, as if the whole restaurant had turned its eyes toward her, waiting to see what would happen next. Some staff avoided her altogether, as though whatever had drawn Victor Blackwell's attention might rub off like a curse. Others watched her with quiet envy, muttering that she had been lucky, that no one else ever walked away from his table with their dignity intact, let alone with his money. But luck had nothing to do with it, and Aisha knew it. She hadn't played a game. She had simply refused to erase herself. On Tuesday, when Victor's car pulled up once again, there was no lottery. Everyone knew who would serve him. Aisha straightened her apron, tied her hair neatly, and stepped into the dining room with the calm resolve of someone walking into a storm with eyes open. This time, he looked at her the moment she approached, his gaze sharp and unwavering. "You again," he said, not cold but not welcoming either. "Yes, sir," Aisha replied smoothly. "I'll be serving you tonight." His eyes narrowed slightly as though he were searching for something in her face. "Interesting," he murmured, then set the menu aside. "I'll have the sea bass, poached, no garnish, and a Montrachet, 2005. Make sure it's not rushed. If it tastes young, I'll send it back." Aisha noted the order without hesitation, repeating it back with the same calm tone. But inside she felt the shift. He wasn't simply ordering food, he was testing her, pushing boundaries. Every word was a trap waiting for her to stumble, to reveal uncertainty or fear. Yet she did not flinch. In the kitchen, Chef Tony raised an eyebrow. "Sea bass, no garnish? The man wants fish without the art? That's like asking for a painting without colors." "Then make the brush strokes perfect," Aisha replied softly. "Every detail counts." Marco shook his head over the Montrachet. "He's serious about this one. 2005 is delicate. Serve it wrong and he'll never forgive you." But Aisha only nodded, watching each movement as carefully as a surgeon. She stood by while Marco decanted the wine, memorizing every step, committing to precision. She hovered near the stove as the base was poached, ensuring the timing was flawless. By the time she carried the tray back to table 7, she felt the weight of the entire staff's eyes on her back. Victor examined the wine as though it held secrets no one else could see. He swirled, sniffed, tasted, and let the silence stretch, long enough to make even the guests at nearby tables uneasy. Then he nodded once, almost imperceptibly. "Acceptable." The fish, too, passed his inspection. He ate slowly, deliberately, and each time she returned to check, his eyes lingered, on her for a second longer than before. Not in admiration, not in cruelty, but in a strange kind of calculation, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle she represented. When the evening ended and the bill was signed, Aisha braced herself for the usual envelope. But this time, beneath the tip, he had written something different. "Do you always stand so straight?" It wasn't a question about posture. It was something deeper, a recognition of the way she carried herself. She stared at the words, her chest tight, and for the first time she felt a chill of something more dangerous than fear. Curiosity. That night, the whispers among the staff grew louder. "He's noticing her," Brenda muttered, her voice thick with disdain. "He's never noticed anyone before. This won't end well." Mr. Carter's warning echoed in Aisha's mind as she walked home beneath the city lights. Power is a weapon, and when a man like Victor Blackwell turns his attention on you, it's never without reason. At home, her mother asked about her day, but Aisha only smiled and said, "It was fine." She did not mention the note. She did not mention the way his eyes had searched hers. Some storms were better faced alone, but in the quiet of her room, staring at the ceiling, Aisha knew the truth. Victor Blackwell wasn't just a tyrant in a suit. He was a man with a wound so deep it bled into every corner of his life. She had seen it in the flicker of his eyes, in the sharpness of his control, and somehow, without meaning to, she had stepped into the center of his storm. The question was no longer whether she could survive him. It was what he would do now that he could not ignore her. Breaking the script by the fourth Tuesday, the tension in the Gilded Spoon was unlike anything the staff had ever experienced. It was no longer simply the fear of serving Victor Blackwell. That had been the old ritual, the nervous glances, the silent prayers, the desperate avoidance of Table 7. Now, the fear had twisted into something new, something more unsettling. Curiosity. Everyone had begun to sense that something was happening between Aisha and Victor, though none of them could define it. It was not romantic, not friendly, not hostile in the ordinary sense. It was as if the billionaire had finally found an opponent on his stage, and each Tuesday was another round of a performance only the two of them fully understood. Brenda muttered about it constantly, her voice thick with jealousy and warning. "He's pulling her in," she said to anyone who would listen. "Mark my words, this is how it happens. He notices, he tests, he crushes. No one walks away clean." The younger staff, wide-eyed and anxious, whispered theories of their own. Some thought Victor was toying with her because she had dared to meet his gaze. Others believed he was punishing her slowly, waiting for the right moment to strike. But none could deny that the rules had changed. The man who ignored everyone else had chosen her. Mr. Carter, who had always carried himself with the weary calm of a veteran, now seemed more troubled than ever. He pulled Aisha aside before service that Tuesday, his brow furrowed deeply. "You need to listen to me, Aisha. I've seen what happens to people who get too close to him. A ruined career, a lost contract, doors shut that you didn't even know existed. He doesn't like to lose, and if he thinks you've unsettled him, he'll find a way to remind you who holds the power." Aisha met his eyes with quiet strength. "I understand, Mr. Carter, but I can't erase myself. If I bow to him completely, then I've already lost." Carter shook his head, torn between admiration and dread. "Strength is good, but pride can be dangerous. Be careful that your courage doesn't cost you everything." That night, Victor arrived later than usual. His sleek car slid to the curb, and once again the air seemed to grow heavier in the dining room. Aisha smoothed her apron, lifted her chin, and walked toward Table 7 with deliberate grace. She could feel the eyes of the entire staff on her, each one silently begging her to survive another night. Victor's gaze locked on her the moment she approached. This time he did not wait for her greeting. "Do you always walk as if the floor belongs to you?" he asked, his tone cutting but curious. "I walk as though I belong here, sir," Aisha replied evenly. "Because I do." His eyes narrowed, slightly, but no anger flashed across his face. Instead, he gestured for her to proceed. "Bring me the duck confit. No sauce, no garnish." and a Romane Conti, 1999. If it's mishandled, I'll know. The order was another test, a deliberate trap. The Romane Conti was one of the rarest wines in the world, a bottle worth a fortune, a treasure that sommeliers spoke of in reverent tones. Mishandling it, even slightly, could have ended Aisha's career in an instant. But she did not falter. She repeated the order back calmly and moved toward the kitchen, each step steady despite the thundering of her heart. In the kitchen, Marco nearly dropped his glass when he heard, "Romane Conti? Does he think we're running a museum here? That bottle is worth more than my car." "Then treat it with more care than your car," Aisha replied quietly. She stayed beside him, watching every movement, every gesture, as if she could memorize the ritual by sheer focus. Marco, though nervous, found himself steadier in her presence as though her calmness was contagious. The duck confit came out perfectly crisp, its aroma filling the kitchen, and the wine was decanted with reverence. When Aisha returned to the table, she poured with slow precision, the ruby liquid shimmering under the chandelier's glow. Victor's eyes never left her, not even when he lifted the glass to his lips. He tasted, held the wine in his mouth, then swallowed with deliberate slowness. For a long moment, silence hung between them. Then at last he said, "Better than most." It was the closest thing to praise he had ever given. The staff who overheard it later would whisper about it as though it were a myth, a story too unlikely to be true. But Victor was not finished. Throughout the meal, he gave small, sharp instructions designed to unsettle her. "Stand closer." "No. Further." "Hold. The tray lower. Don't touch the edge." Each command was delivered with cold precision, as though he were chiseling away at stone. Any other server would have stumbled, flinched, or collapsed under the weight of it. But Aisha obeyed without losing herself, following his words without letting them pierce her dignity. She was not a servant, she was a professional. And slowly, impossibly, she began to see something flicker in his expression. Not anger, not contempt, but something closer to recognition. When the meal ended, Victor signed the bill as usual. But this time, instead of leaving only a tip, he left a folded note tucked into the folder. Aisha waited until he had left before opening it, her hands trembling slightly despite her calm exterior. Inside, in his sharp handwriting, were 3 words, "Meet me tomorrow." Her heart thudded in her chest. It was not phrased as a request, but as an order, the kind of command he was used to giving in boardrooms and contracts. Yet it was directed at her. That night, in the staff room, Brenda was nearly beside herself. "What did I tell you?" she hissed. "He's pulling you in. You think you're standing your ground, but this is his game, and when he's finished, you'll be nothing." Carter, too, looked troubled. "You don't owe him anything, Aisha. If you meet him, know what you're walking into. He doesn't invite people into his world without reason. And for people like him, reason is never simple." Aisha said nothing. Her thoughts were a storm. She thought of her mother's frail smile, her sister's tuition, the weight of the bills. She thought of the way Victor's eyes lingered on her, not with desire, not with cruelty, but with something else, something harder to define. And she thought of the truth she had begun to sense. Victor Blackwell was not simply a tyrant. He was a man carrying a wound so deep it had hardened into armor. That night she lay awake staring at the ceiling, the note still in her hand. "Meet me tomorrow." The words were heavy with meaning she could not yet see. But one thing was certain. The storm she had stepped into was about to pull her deeper, into a place no one else had ever dared to go. Respect goes both ways. The night Aisha found the note, she hardly slept. She lay awake in her small bedroom, staring at the cracks in the ceiling while the city hummed faintly outside the window. Her mother's quiet breathing filled the silence of the apartment, and the soft rustle of pages told her that Maya had stayed up late studying again. But Aisha's mind was not in that room. It was circling around 3 words written in sharp, jagged handwriting. "Meet me tomorrow." It was not phrased as a question or a request. It was an order, the kind of thing men like Victor Blackwell were used to giving in boardrooms, the kind of thing others obeyed without hesitation. But Aisha was not one of his employees, and she was not someone who would be summoned like a servant. She wrestled with the choice through the night. Part of her wanted to ignore the note, to burn it even, to prove that she was not another name in his endless list of people bent to his will. Yet another part of her, quieter but more persistent, wanted to know why. Why her? Why now? Why was the most feared man in the restaurant paying attention to her in a way he had never paid attention to anyone else? When morning came, she found her answer not in clarity, but in necessity. Bills still waited on the kitchen table, and her mother's new treatment had been mentioned by the doctor with a cost that made Aisha's stomach tighten. She couldn't afford to live in fear. She couldn't afford to turn away from opportunity, even if it came dressed as danger. The following evening, she arrived at the small address scribbled on the bottom of the note, a private suite in a downtown hotel. The building was grand but quiet, the kind of place where business moguls and politicians met in secret, where privacy was valued above spectacle. The receptionist gave her a discreet nod when she mentioned the name Blackwell, as though the staff had already been warned of her arrival. The suite itself was nothing like she had expected. She thought it would be lavish, gilded with excess like the gilded spoon, but instead, it was spare, minimal, and almost cold. Floor to ceiling. Windows overlooked the city skyline, but the lights of the towers seemed muted behind the heavy glass. At the center sat Victor Blackwell, not in a suit but in a simple black shirt, his sleeves rolled up, a glass of water beside him. For the first time, he looked less like a billionaire carved out of stone and more like a man who had been hollowed. "Out by years of silence you came," he said, his voice quiet, almost surprised. "I don't take orders," Aisha replied, standing tall. "I came because I chose to." For the first time since she had met him, Victor's lips twitched into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Good. Sit." She sat across from him, her back straight, her eyes steady. The silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile, as though both were waiting for the other to break it. At last, Victor leaned forward, his gray eyes piercing. "Do you know why I watch you?" he asked. Aisha didn't flinch. "Because I don't bow." His gaze lingered on her, then dropped briefly to the glass of water. "Most people bend. They call it respect, but it's fear. You don't. You stand straight. You look me in the eye. And for the first time in a long time, I wonder if I've been wrong." Her breath caught at his words, but she did not soften. "Respect goes both ways, Mr. Blackwell. If you want it, you must give it." For a moment, something flickered in his expression, something raw, unguarded. He turned toward the window, his voice lower now, carrying a weight it had never held. "Before, my wife and daughter were killed by a drunk driver, a man with money, with connections, with the right friends. He walked out of court free, smiling. I buried my family while he toasted with his friends. Since that day, I decided I would never be weak again, never let anyone take from me, never let anyone have the power to dismiss me." Aisha's chest tightened. She had heard whispers of the story before, but hearing it in his own voice was different. His words were not an excuse, but a confession. The anger, the coldness, the cruelty. It was all armor forged in grief. "I understand pain," she said, softly. "I understand what it means to lose, to carry burdens that no one else sees. But pain doesn't give you the right to wound others. It doesn't excuse cruelty." Victor's eyes snapped back to hers, sharp again, but not with anger, with challenge. "And what would you have me do, forgive? Forget? Let the world take advantage of me again?" "No," Aisha said firmly. "But you can choose not to become the same kind of man who hurt you. You can choose to lead with respect, not fear. Because fear fades, respect endures." The silence that followed was long and heavy. Victor leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before his mouth, his eyes searching hers as though she were the first person in years to speak to him without trembling. For once, he did not have an immediate reply. Finally, he said, almost reluctantly, "You speak as if you know strength." "I do," Aisha answered. "Strength isn't crushing others. Strength is carrying your burdens and still choosing to be kind. Strength is standing straight when the world tries to bend. Strength is surviving, and helping others survive too." Something in Victor's face broke then. Not completely, not in a way that anyone else might notice, but enough. His shoulders sagged slightly, his gaze softened for the briefest moment, and in that flicker Aisha saw the man beneath the armor, the husband who had lost his wife, the father who had lost his child, the human who had never learned how to live with grief except by turning it into control. The meeting ended not with a contract, not with threats, but with a strange, quiet understanding. Victor dismissed her with a nod, his words short but different from anything he had spoken before. "You've given me something to think about." The following weeks at the Gilded Spoon were unlike any others. Victor still came every Tuesday, still ordered with precision, still tested with small commands. But there was a difference now. His words carried less edge, his eyes less frost. And though he never offered open praise, he never again dismissed Aisha as a rookie or a mistake. The staff noticed too. The man they had once feared like a storm now seemed, if not softened, at least altered. His wrath no longer lashed out at the smallest mistakes. His silence no longer pressed like a weight on every breath. For Aisha, the change was not in the tips he left, though they continued to be generous. It was in the way he began to acknowledge her humanity, if only in subtle ways, a nod of respect, a pause before giving an order, a glance that carried something almost like gratitude. She had not tamed him, had not broken him, but she had forced him to rewrite the script. Months later, when her mother's new treatment was finally covered, when Maya's tuition was secured, Aisha found an envelope slipped quietly into her locker. Inside was a note written in that same sharp hand. Respect goes both ways. Beneath it was a check, not signed with his name but through one of his companies, covering the full cost of her mother's medical care for the next year. Tears blurred her vision, but she held her head high as she read the words again. It was not charity. It was not pity. It was recognition. It was respect. In the end, Aisha Ross had done what no one else dared. She had stood her ground against the storm and reminded even the most powerful man in the room that power, without respect, was nothing. The Gilded Spoon would never forget it. The staff would whisper about it for years, and Victor Blackwell himself would carry it like a scar and a lesson. Because sometimes, the strongest act of courage was not defiance, not victory, but the quiet insistence on dignity, and in that quiet something greater was born, change.